So the title of the book is Stand on Guard for Whom? Right? Who is this institution guarding, protecting? Right? I think that's a question that we don't ask enough about the military, certainly, and maybe some other institutions as well. And if you go back into the history of the Canadian military, the Canadian military, of course, is just the former, it's the British military, right? The roots of the Canadian military are, the bases, the naval bases were, former British naval bases that became Canadian naval bases. So its roots are as the entity that helped colonize these lands, right? Turtle Island. Also part of a force that, and I go into the book of some of the destruction of the Mi'kmaq in the east, and some of the gunboat diplomacy in the 1860s up along the coast here throughout what's now British Columbia, threatening to destroy, to fire cannons on indigenous communities, to basically follow the orders or else kind of stuff, and I go through some of that in the book. Obviously, also in the suppressing the Métis and indigenous rebellions in the prairies in the late 1800s. Additionally, the Royal Military College in Kingston, set up in 1876, according to a Department of National Defense historian, in his words, to train proper white gentlemen to be officers of British imperialism, right? Individuals who helped conquer Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, helped, fought in Afghanistan and India, right? The Canadian military's roots are as this force that was the British Empire conquering much of the world, right? That's not up for discussion. Those are the roots. We don't tend to talk about that. I mean, you still have the name Royal in the Air Force and the name, right? The Royal is still in the name. So that's its roots. When we talk about who it's standing on guard for, I think there still is the colonial element to the military in that sense. Other part of who it's standing on guard for, that I was an element of doing research in the book that I wasn't familiar with, which is quite interesting history, is the role of the militia from Confederation to the early 1930s in suppressing strikes. Right? They were called out about 70 times to suppress strikes, different parts of the country, just repeatedly, over and over again. Right? Ostensibly, it was to protect order, but invariably it was on behalf of the employers and people fighting to get union recognition, 9-hour work days, health, safety, concerns. Repeatedly, the militia is called out. Oftentimes, employers paid for the militia to house the militia so they could stay for 3 months, or sometimes it got fairly violent. So in the book, I go through some of the class element of the military right until today, right, where you have all these billionaires like Jeff Molson, the owner of the Montreal Canadiens and the heir to the Molson brewery, like the Desmarais, who are honorary colonels and honorary generals of different units of the Canadian military. Right? You never have labor leaders that are honorary positions, but lots of prominent capitalists, top-tier capitalists and mid-tier capitalists. So there's also that element when we talk about who the military is standing on guard for. Now, of course, yesterday was Remembrance Day, and we're really pumped around Remembrance Day, this whole idea, lest we forget, this whole idea of the benevolent Canadian military upholding democracy, upholding freedoms. And if you go on to what the Veterans Affairs, all those millions and millions of dollars that are spent in public funds in recent days, recent weeks, or the Remembrance Day activities, almost every time they talk about the wars, they talk about these democracy, human rights, and stuff like that. But if we're going to be serious about Remembrance Day, well, we should really look at the history of Canadian warfare, right? 1884, about 400 Canadians sent to Sudan to protect the British position in Khartoum that was being threatened by indigenous Sudanese revolts. In 1899, 7,000 Canadians sent to South Africa. For what? Right? To protect the British sea route to the very profitable Indian colony, and because Cecil Rhodes wanted minerals, right? The minerals that have been found in the different colonies in what's now South Africa. 20,000, 28,000 Boer women and children killed in concentration camps. We don't know exactly how many because they didn't keep the numbers on the black Africans, but thought to be a similar number of Africans killed in those concentration camps. World War I, about 400,000 Canadians that fought in that horrible imperialist conflict, where Canadians helped the British and the French take control over parts of East Africa, West Africa. Canadians garrisoned British colonies during World War I in the Caribbean. Right? This was not about democracy. This was about the end of the scramble, European scramble for Africa. The Korean War, 27,000 Canadians sent to Korea a year after the Chinese have a nationalist communist revolution, so it's about checking China, checking Mao's forces, and also there was an economic downturn in the US and Canada after World War II, and so the Korean War was basically military Keynesianism. It was a way to justify this huge spending on the military industry to stabilize the capitalist system, and amidst this downturn, of course, the World War II was part of what got out of the Great Depression, right? So 3 to 4 million Koreans, what was essentially a civil war that the Americans stoked the civil war beforehand, but 3 to 4 million people are killed in the Korean War. The first Iraq, early 90s, the first Iraq War, where about 4,000 Canadians participated in this war, which, as Mark Curtis put it, was the open rehabilitation of colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East. Iraq has still yet to recover. It's just been one after another since that early 90s attack. The late 90s, 18 Canadian fighter jets bombing the former Yugoslavia, dropping 530 bombs. For what? Right? To divide Yugoslavia, because they wanted to push a privatization agenda. 40,000 Canadians who fought in Afghanistan. Right? Look at Afghanistan today. Now the Taliban looks like the progressive, feministic force next to the ISIS. I mean, it's just stoked even more extremist kind of what was that all about? 13 years, that conflict. However many hundreds of thousands who died, right? Directly and indirectly. Libya, 2011, right? A Canadian general leads the NATO campaign, the bombing campaign. Half dozen Canadian fighter jets, Canadian naval vessels, Canadian special forces on the ground, explicitly against the UN resolutions. The African Union desperately tried to have a negotiated solution in Libya. Desperately tried beforehand. They said, don't do this. What's going to happen with the weaponry? This is not going to just destabilize Libya. This is going to destabilize the Sahel region, which is exactly what happened. Exactly. We then sent troops to Mali to stabilize Mali after the conflict went straight south from Libya into Mali. From Boko Haram in the west in Nigeria to Al-Shabaab in the east in Somalia, the campaign in Libya, weaponry was found that circulated, a certain amount of heightening the instability. It is exactly what multiple African heads of state tried to travel to Libya to figure out negotiations, totally ignored it. Canada, the US, and other NATO ignored all their efforts. The Canadian intelligence, military intelligence, had a report from about a year and a half before the war saying explicitly that in the east of Libya, that it was basically jihadist forces were strong, right? And that the likely result of conflict was to have a civil war that would go on for, well, it's now 11 years or 10 years. So they knew that beforehand. The Canadian pilots joked that they were Al-Qaeda's Air Force. Right? They joked that David Puglisi, the Ottawa Citizen military reporter, they told him how they joked that that's what they were doing. They understood what was going on politically. So if you look at the history of Canadian warfare, there's only one war that you can make a case was morally justified, right? Which is World War II. Now that war, as we know, there's all kinds of things the Canadian government did beforehand that, enabled fascism in Spain and all this kind of stuff, all the kind of things that enabled the Japanese massacres in China and whatever. So all kinds of things that Canada, Britain, US could have done differently to revert World War II. So I would argue Canada is among the more warlike nations in the last century, despite all the rhetoric.